their community, but in turn, how that is, of course, affecting them corporally, cancers, the women in that neighborhood that are struggling with their pregnancies, children who are developing asthma at extremely young ages. So again, like really understanding the violence, the place annihilation that we do on land has a direct correlation to us. And similarly, when I was doing interviews, oral histories with former Chamisa residents who were displaced by the Chamisa Treaty, the very first woman that I interviewed, her name was Maria Eugenia Trillo. She said to me, and I pulled it up here because I always come back to this. She said, when they dispersed our community, it was as if they had cut off the hand or the arm, but that you could still feel the fingers. You would look down and there was nothing there, but you could still feel it. And that's how we feel. And it makes me think of, well, of what you were saying, Monica, the burden of being truth tellers. And that it's the burden of being storytellers, truth tellers, but also how that burden shows up materially on the body. For instance, through something such as a kind of quasi-phantom limb.
The question is about violence. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to, well, for mapping violence, we collect cases of people who encounter violence and their lives end in death, but also cases of intimidation. And, understanding that to understand racial terror, we have to move beyond a body count. And I think Annette's work in her theorization of violence and the spectacle, but also the visual grammar, and how people are impacted who are in communities away, but who see or the reporting, to come to Danielle's piece about the impact of the newspaper coverage and how that was, inflicted terror. So for me, trying to understand lives impacted, moving beyond just a moment of violent event. And so thinking about the sort of long-term impact, generational trauma, and how those injustices are passed down to future generations, but also the wisdom and the skills of community care and examples of community-led healing, and the commitment to staying, like the Bazan family, Epigmenia Bazan. So I think, for me, the work of documenting violence, you can only really continue to do the work if you're also documenting people who are advocating for change, for an end to that violence, for a more just future, because those are the voices that I think buoy us, help us find a path, think creatively, but that we can be in community with. So, reading the writings of people like Jovita Idad, for example, can, in so many opportunities or times in the archival research, lifted me up, and I felt the improvement to my well-being compared to when I was reading newspapers celebrating the violence or listening to oral history celebrating the violence. So I think that's the hard part, is to not only document the violence and the communities impacted, but also the people who called out injustice in that contemporary moment, and to be inspired by them. And those are the people who the students, when we teach these difficult histories, students are able to learn very difficult topics. They're able to get their heads around it and also to think about, and be inspired by people who were calling for change. And so I think that's part of what we have to hold all that complexity. And from my work with Gloria Gonzalez Lopez, who I think is still here, always thinking about prioritizing as researchers and as members of our community our own well-being, and prioritizing, insisting that our well-being it has to be priority for us to continue to do this work.
Actually, you said something there, and I kind of want to ask Jonathan and Alana their thoughts on y'all. How do y'all deal with researching violence all of the time? Because I was telling Dr. Martinez this a little while ago, I initially was going to research lynching as well, and after looking at the photographs and like reading the reports, and what I was realizing that I feel kind of ill quite often. Like whenever I start thinking about this, or when I have to edit the papers or whatever, it's just it's a very difficult thing. So how do you immerse yourself in such horrible things, right, and still maintain the sanity or even that enthusiasm to continue and maintain your job as storyteller? Oh no, yeah, I was referencing the thing you said about the enthusiasm. Yeah. What do y'all? How do y'all do that?
I'll start by saying that when I first started the work, I knew that I was going to be thinking about violence in terms of displacement, being forcibly removed from one's home and community, and the violence of erasure. The neighborhoods that were displaced as a result of the Chamizal Treaty were literally bulldozed and demolished in order to return that land back to Mexico. And that land is now, for the most part, a public park in Ciudad Juarez. So I knew I was going to be thinking about violence in that way. I did not anticipate thinking about like the kind of violence that like the real kind of material, more obvious violence. And it really wasn't until I got deeper into the archive and started reading affidavits and testimonies from the late 1800s and early 1900s from these residents in Partido Chamizal. I really just thought I was going to write about the Chamizal barrios from the 1960s. And again, got deeper and deeper into, there was actually a Chamizal district in Paso del Norte, and that district is currently Segundo Barrio in El Paso, Texas. So Segundo Barrio is Partido Chamizal. Partido Chamizal is still north of the Rio Grande. El Paso is still built on, of course, layers of theft, but is built on stolen land. And so I was surprised to see stories of Partido Chamizal residents being, describing nighttime raids. I had read your book and then later came to these affidavits and was like, oh my gosh, I'm looking at similar things that you were describing, what David Montejano was describing. Families talking about being pulled from their beds in the middle of the night and thrown into the street and beat bloody repeatedly, even if they came back to their properties. And in terms of, it was of course difficult, but I felt a profound sense of responsibility to try to tell this story, because most folks don't know, and I didn't know when I started this work, that El Chamizal is still in El Paso, Texas. We often think that El Chamizal was given back to Ciudad Juarez, and in a way it was, but that was a symbolic tract of land. And I felt this immense responsibility to try to tell this story that El Paso still stands on stolen land, and that was stolen quite violently.
So at Brown, I was trained by La Mera Mera, Muñoz Martinez, and we had lots of conversations about violence and what it means to be doing this history. And the only thing I can really say is that I've moved past those conversations to an acceptance that it's a responsibility. People from Uvalde, people from Rotterdam, we're not supposed to be here. And there's an active agenda to get rid of us. The only thing I can say is that if you're going to invest yourself in doing this work, do it well. You owe it to people you will never meet. Sleep, drink water, exercise, eat something healthy, build a community. Those are things that are going to sustain you.
Can I ask you Gloria Gonzalez Lopez question?
Sure.
Okay, on behalf of Gloria Gonzalez Lopez, what brings you joy?
I love that question.
And then we'll open it up.
Yeah. I mean, lots of things bring me joy, but I think one of the most things is like fresh, squeezed glass of orange juice. Yeah.
Sleeping in brings me immense joy, and naps in the middle of a hot day with the window open.
Jonathan said we needed sleep pods here. For 2 days. I will say I have a 5-year-old who demands joy, demands it, which is very good for my well-being. But I've gotten really into, she's a sleepyhead, so I've gotten really into waking her up with music and my own choreography. And if, mostly she goes like this. But she laughs, and making her laugh first thing in the morning with my silly dance to my favorite tunes has become a good morning ritual for bringing me joy.
Very good.
So the name of the panel is not up there anymore, but the name of the panel is Looking Forward in Texas History, and I'm curious rather, how y'all see your work as looking forward, because these are works of history, right? They're preoccupied with looking backward, but what is, I guess, I mean, I'm sure you can't tell me the destination, right? But what are some stops on the way that you see coming up? Right? How do you think your work is getting us there, or moving us towards that, or yeah?
I think for me that happens mostly in the classroom. Part of my teaching philosophy is that when students leave the classroom, I need them to understand better the world that they've inherited, and that in that sense, I think getting them to a certain understanding, whether it be about immigration history, U.S. history, social movement history, that's what's happened in the past, that they are the ones that will carry things forward more than I ever will, just by terms of age, right? And so I think for me, that work happens in the classroom, and similar to Anglos and Mexicans, right? Doing your due diligence in writing a solid piece of writing that is going to have longevity. I think nowadays, CJ and I have talked about this, about that one thing that historians can do better is be writers, be disciplined writers, and be good at the craft of writing. That can sustain decades, as Anglos and Mexicans has.
I would say also in the classroom, especially teaching history, really emphasizing to my students, of course, the essential and transformative potential of our primary sources. Not just the ones that we're studying in the class to understand our past, but the primary sources that they're going to inherit coming next, right? And having the skills and the thoughtfulness and the critical eye to look at the primary sources that are around the corner, that are currently blocked off, held from us, but will be released soon, and what they'll be able to do with that. And then the other thing that comes to mind is students and other PhD students really leaning into doing microhistories. And I think David Montejano's book really gives us the invitation and the blessing to do microhistories. I mean, his book is so comprehensive, but as you spoke to, and as so many others have spoke to, it is an encyclopedia for all of these little microhistories. And I was discouraged time and time again that, my work on the chamizal was good for a dissertation, but I would have to do something bigger and more comprehensive for the book, because doing a microhistory just wasn't going to be good enough for a first book. And I really had to push back against that. And I think that I'm seeing more graduate students now that are leaning into the microhistory and are gaining more confidence in focusing on something that's seemingly quite small, but in fact is quite transformative.
I think in one case, for the work that we're doing in Uvalde, it's a multidisciplinary team. And so thinking with scholars to answer questions, to center what are community needs today and how can researchers be in service to those communities is something that's just been, a privilege to work with a team of researchers who want to be in service to communities impacted by mass violence, but in communities impacted by trauma now is something that I think as a society we're wrapping our heads around. The need to start to anticipate the needs of people who experienced trauma, potentially traumatic events, or potentially secondary trauma, So working with experts in fields who can help us, that we can all think together about responding to those needs. And I think historically can provide that context about how societies are impacted if we don't respond. So in the aftermath of violence and massacres, how it does impact communities for well over a century. And I forgot the question. Oh, in terms of the way that our work is making an impact. I mean, I think so. That's and for thinking about just the response to David's work, whether it's a social history, sociology, I forgot all the different terms. It's multidisciplinary. It's interdisciplinary. And I think that's what we're seeing, in terms of the advancements in the field, and where, the young generations of scholars are refusing these kinds of institutional boundaries, and will use whatever kind of methods they need and get training in multiple methods to answer these big questions. But in terms of the mapping violence work and, the race laws in the Southwest, studying inequality in the Southwest, thinking regionally, thinking comparatively, thinking across different racial and ethnic groups, and, with the goal of saying, I want to build these archives and make them public, and then give public access to researchers to work with those archives. I think that's a public practice that I've embraced, really inspired by the historians like Matt Garcia, Christine, who she's already retired, right? From the who worked on the Bracero Oral History Project and conducted oral histories, digitized them, made them public. And I remember, there were some scholars who were like, aren't you going to write your book first before you make these publicly available? And his approach was like, no, we need to advance the field with an understanding of this history of the Bracero program and its impact, not only in the United States, but in Mexico. And there's enough here for everybody. And so I think, again, thinking about the practice of documenting histories, making them publicly available, and thinking about who, again, are the professionals doing work that can't do their work well if they don't know the histories.